Thank you, Kathy, for those kind words. If that seemed like a lot of stuff, just remember that I've been doing this for 36 years. Did not happen. Before I begin, I want to take just a minute to familiarize some of you with the Family Institute, which you may or may not have heard about. The Institute has been around for a long time, and our main office is on the Northwestern campus in Evanston. But we also have a large clinical space in Northbrook, we do three things at the Family Institute. We do clinical service, which we do through our staff practice of 60 licensed clinicians, and social work, psychology, marriage and family therapy, and counseling. We also have a sliding scale clinic where we see individuals, families who don't have insurance and can't afford private practice home fee. We also do a lot of education and training of counselors and therapists. And we do research on psychotherapy and what actually makes it work. So those are all the things we do. A couple of things that you might be particularly interested in. Well, one of the things that we offer is a career counseling package for people who are changing careers or who have gotten out of college and are uncertain about what they're going to do. So on the table outside, I've left a number of brochures about that. There's a brochure of general interest about the Institute, there's my business cards, and then there's one more thing I want to tell you, which is one of our community services is that we offer through email and a 300-word tip every month. Actually, we offer two of them. One is our tip for couples and one is our tip for families. And these are very practical things. All we need is your best email. We don't need your name. We'll never send you anything else because of this. But our tips go out to, I think, 16,000 people a month now. And they are things like, how can you complain to a spouse in a way that your spouse is actually liable to sue you? What do you do when your child says, no, I won't turn my phone off, or I won't turn the computer off, and treat people. So they're very practical, very quick reads, and we just send them out once a month. You can sign up for either of them with us. So take a look out there, and as I said, my business card is there. If you have any questions, feel free to get hold of me. So this is a group that I feel very at home with. I have been a working mom for my entire career. I was talking to Kathy earlier, we compared our stories, which are not dissimilar. I've always worked, but I've worked in different ways, at different levels. I worked sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time. Sometimes I had the good luck to have a work experience that was very flexible. And all of those things informed the remarks I'm going to make to you today. Tip for your future when you're doing public speaking, be sure to check on what size font you actually need before you do your final. I should really do a 16. So over 100 years ago, Freud said the two problems, this is the truest thing you have to step by the way, the two problems that you have to solve in life are work and love. And the value of both of those enterprises is that they keep us away from being too self-involved. They put us in relationship to the world and other people. And when he said that, what he was thinking, of course, being a Victorian Viennese professional man, was that everybody should solve the problem of love, and men needed to solve the problem of work because women already had that problem solved. They were supposed to be staying at home, making a home, and raising children. And he might have changed his mind when he lived in the 21st century, but that's interesting. So that is still true for men, but the work-love dilemma is much more complicated for women, as all of you are already aware. The last 100 years of the women's movement has raised expectations about women, and women have risen to meet those expectations. So you probably know already that more than half of all college graduates are female, and that women are about close to 50% of current graduating classes, both in medical and law school, and more than a third of graduates from MBA programs. So there are very few barriers left to the entry-level work that educated women want to do. And to get to that point, women and their families have made enormous investments. If you started today and you went through brand name schools like Northwestern all the way, by the time you got your graduate degree, you could easily $250,000 of investment. And someone pays that investment back. Investments are made with the expectations that they will eventually pay off. So what a shame if you have all that talent, all that experience, and all that education, and you don't get to maximize the use of it. So let me just quickly, we started a little bit late, so I'm going to quickly go through some things so I get to the main points I want to share with you. So at the entry level, most of you were in the job force and you were successful. And you did or didn't have a conscious plan of what would I do after I had children and got married and everything. Almost everybody nowadays works once they get married. They just sail through, they take a week off or 2 weeks off on the honeymoon. They have the wedding ceremony or all the expenses on their Excel spreadsheet. They organize it and it's just fun. And so they sail through that. And one of the things that's really changed in male-female relationships in the last 40 years is that newlyweds are extremely equitable in their share of the things that people least want to share. That is, those tasks of household life that are the least desirable. Emptying the trash, doing the dishes, making the beds, doing the laundry, the things that you have to do every single day or once a week, and they just get all messed up again anyway. So no one really gets thrilled about doing them. But those things get shared very equitably in young married couples. And then the first child comes along. And that's when life really changes. How many of you had any experience of that? So I have to go deeply into it. But let me just tell you that there is something that I hope will offer those of you who are in the midst of this phase comfort. There is a very famous, if you're a very sociology type, very famous curve, the graph that's called the Marital Satisfaction curve. And it graphs marital satisfaction against time. And what it shows is that nobody gets married, or very few people, fortunately, get married unless their satisfaction with their partner is very high. And marriage then happens, and the satisfaction drifts downward very slightly over the first few years. And then there's the first child born. And marital satisfaction falls off a cliff. Now, the good news is, whether you have one child or 7 doesn't really matter. It doesn't keep going down. It just bumps along some bottom for a while. And then, later on, if you make it through the bumpy period, which is life, then, towards the end, meaning after the last child has gone off to college, the marital satisfaction curve goes up again. And couples who have survived to that point report that actually the most satisfying years of married life are after the children have left home and have jobs, hopefully. So, but then there's that big chunk, which is clearly, having lived through this myself, my kids are now 27 and 32, having lived through that stage where they were at home, their dad and I were working, and we were trying to do the best we could by them. That was without question the most challenging time of our lives. So what do people do about that? Most people, most women don't have a choice because their families can't afford for them not to stay in the paid workforce, so they do. So 51% of all women who give birth in this country are back at work 4 months later. And 80% of all women whose youngest child is at least 12 is working. Not necessarily full-time, but is in the paid workforce. But for women who come from the privilege of affluence, where they're married and there's a breadwinner who is making a living that's sufficient to support a family, a lot of women decide, sometimes not after the first child, sometimes not till the second or the third child come along, that it's just too much. It's too much stress on the family, and there needs to be a time out here. If you are in certain fields, like I was, if you are a person who can work part-time because that's an option in your field, then you might continue to do that even on a very limited basis. And probably that's truly the easiest thing to do from the long view of a career. Because if you never take any time out and you just say, for instance, as a therapist, I was in private practice for 6 years. People don't know. They don't really ask, well, did you see 3 clients a week or did you see 28 clients a week? you were in private practice, right? But if you are a banker or you work in a corporate setting where you don't get the option of job sharing or going part-time, then often you end up with some blank space in the resume. And I'm not going to address that because I know that's being addressed in other places. There was an interesting piece in the New York Times Magazine, which is still one of the only places I actually get to read regularly. So if I say anything to you that comes out of something I've read, the chances are it's the New York Times Magazine or the New Yorker. Those are the two things I seem to be able to get to. 10 years ago, Lisa Belkin wrote an article on the opt-out generation in which she described women who were similar to many of you, I think, who were highly educated, highly trained, very successful career women who had decided after the birth of the second or third child that they needed time out. And they were in the midst of that time out, often within 2 or 3 years of having left the paid workforce. And the article was quite dreamy about how great this was and how they were just going to do this as long as they felt they wanted or needed to, and then they were going to get back in. And it was not a big deal. They loved their lives, and everything was great. Now, as somebody who is a professional and a working mom, I wondered about whether that was a little bit optimistic about what that journey was going to be like. And I was very actually gratified to hear 10 years later, about 2 months ago, there was a follow-up article, not by Lisa Belkin, but another woman who actually went back and interviewed these women 10 years later and found out what happened, which, not surprisingly, was a varied story. So some of them were happily doing volunteer work in their communities. Their kids were now in high school or in college, and they had no aspirations to go back into the paid workforce. Others of them had suffered various kinds of losses, the death of a spouse, an unexpected divorce, a bankruptcy, something had happened and forced them back into the workforce. And some of them were very successful in that, and others of them were really still trying to reinvent and make that all work for themselves. So my point about that is there's lots of different paths, and they can all work. But that my experience is that unless there is something to look forward to that is for you and what you feel you need to do in the way of aspiring to give something, whether it's to increase the knowledge base of the world or help your community or get to a certain level of financial security on your own. Any of those are reasonable goals. And all of them, for most of us, fortunately, for all of those goals, there's time after our kids are in school to still have, to be able to actualize that. Okay, so there are problems, though, and you're hearing about those problems today, and so I'm going to skip over just a couple of them. First of all, what the problem of child care. We are, of course, the only civilized society, the only advanced Western society that still thinks that raising children is a lark for people to do on their own time and without any support. But if you're motivated and you have resources, most people will be able to cobble together between after-school programs and nannies and daycare and retired mothers and fathers and neighbors who help out a way of managing the child care situation. So I'm not going to dwell on that. A second problem, and this is right in my sweet spot of my professional life, is maternal guilt. And I think I can help you with that. Anybody who's worried about that? So let me just tell you a story. I lived with maternal guilt my whole life. I was always worrying about, was I in the right place at the right time? If I was at work half the time I was thinking, is there something I should be doing at home? If I was at home, I was thinking about what I should do at work. So at one point when my daughter was about, let's say, 12 and my son was 17, I had a friend who was going to do a research project, and she needed pilot data, so she asked me to find any to be guinea pigs. So I talked them into it. So we filled out something called a family environment questionnaire, basically a true and false thing. Our family usually is able to work things out, true or false. Our family has fun together, true or false. So you do all these things. And then they went into another room and they sorted these things. Each of us filled this out separately. They sorted out to find out which ones we disagreed with, and then among ourselves. And then they brought them back and they asked us to have a family discussion about what we disagreed with. So there weren't too many of them, but the first one that she pulled out of the bag was, our family has enough time to be together. And 3 of us had answered true, and 1 of us had answered false. I'll let you guess. So she said, would you all like to talk about that? And my son, who is very bright, said, well, first of all, who said, oh wait. He pointed at me. It was you, Mom, right? So I see where this is going. So that engaged us in a little discussion about how I happened to be the only one in the family who thought there was any problem with how much time we spent together. And when they said, what are you talking about? And I gave examples. They brushed them away, all 3 of them. And then the 2 children started talking about how, thank God I had a job. Because as controlling as I was, I would be a burden on them without it. And thank goodness I had something else to put my energies to. You may not have the same issues I do in your life. You may be more flexible than I am. I'm just telling you that maternal guilt is not to be understood as identical to what everybody else in your family is feeling. And there are many, many advantages for children to see their mother working and their father working and the 2 parents working it out. And I'm going to tell you about some of those. Much bigger problems in my office. I see very few problems of parental neglect. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but that's not a problem I see. The problem I see is parental over-involvement and parental overprotection. Helicopter parenting is a much bigger problem among affluent families than underparenting kids. And what gets sacrificed if children are overparented is they lose opportunities to experience themselves as problem solvers and competence. And ultimately, life satisfaction is much more highly correlated with feeling like I am a person who can do things, who can be self-reliant, who can figure things out, who can defer gratification, than I am a person whose parents thought I was great, whose parents did everything for me, who is indulged in my every whim. That doesn't breed confidence or self-esteem. If you are current with the current kind of zeitgeist of self-help literature, there's now a lot of literature coming up about that, based on real research. It's not just somebody's new theory. The real research shows that children do much better when they have actual responsibilities, when they don't get everything when they want it, when they hear no, when they have to figure out some of their own solutions to their own problems. Okay. The third thing I want to spend a little time on is life with balance. Whereas I think of it differently. Cheryl Sanders, who wrote a great book, Lean In, I like the book. She has a very, very privileged life, very narrow shot at how the world is. It's not the same world we all live in. But what she said is, there's no balance. There's life and there's work. It doesn't balance. I have a different perspective on that. And it's informed by the following statement. I think the dilemma is the love of my work and the work of my loves. I am compelled by both things. I've never wanted to choose one or the other. And so how to figure out how to make both of them work well enough for me is my life's work. And I think that can really only be evaluated in the long run. It's a dynamic balance. So I can say to you today, my children are grown, they're out of the house, they're in their own lives. So this morning I was able to arrange my life, so I sat in my favorite place in my own house, rehearsing my talk for today. Nobody called me, nobody bothered me, nobody came to the house, nobody texted. I was able to do my own thing. 10 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. I would have been dealing with the delivery people, this peer person, the school calling about, I wouldn't call it to my daughter, but anyway, she's really good. So I'm now in a place where I can see that I can actualize a different sort of balance than I was able to back then. And where you are in your lives and where I think you're trying to go is going to be in some ways the most challenging. There's a lot of balls up in the air all the time. And as Kathy, the goal is not to keep them all. A few balls can fall. Life will not end if you never sew another homemade Halloween costume. They won't even remember that you always made the Halloween parade. One of the big regrets in my life is the years that I took time out of a job. It was downtown in Chicago. to go up to Wilmette, to be at Central School for the Halloween parade, to see my child for 2 seconds, and my child was basically unaware that I was there. Big waste of time. So there's a lot of those kind of balls that matter if you drop them. Okay. Here's some things that actually help to have life-work balance. The right kind of husband. I hope you've all figured that out. It's taken me a while. I have a great husband. He is very cooperative. We have a very collaborative relationship, and it goes totally smoothly. But that didn't happen automatically. But a husband who believes not just that, well, you can do whatever you want, I don't care, because that means this is still your problem. And his work is not only his problem, it's your problem. You have to facilitate his work by making sure the housework and the kids run smoothly. So him taking some time and putting some actual energy into making sure that you can do what you want will benefit not only you, but him. Women who are unhappy because they don't feel like they're able to do what they want to have a much higher tendency to get clinically depressed than women who are busy with doing things what they want to do. And women who are depressed don't make good mothers or wives. It's a definite barrier to being the kind of wife and mother you want to be. So it is worth pushing to, if you're at the stage now where you're thinking about going back to work, this is the time to sit everybody down and talk about what's this going to mean for them. And do not pretend that it's not going to mean changes for them. It will. But I'm telling you that the data backs up the idea that if you have a spouse who really is with you on this and agrees to make some sacrifices and pitch in an accelerated way, that you are going to be a much happier partner and there will be no other benefits to him, including more sex probably. You can use that if you want, because I can tell you what the reference is. Living in a community of helpfulness is also helpful. I don't know if this is a trend or it's, you can never tell when you have a practice where you want to see a certain number of people every week. Is this the world or is this just the people I happen to be seeing? But 2 times this year, a client in her 50s has come in and said, I can't believe this. My daughter bought a house 2 blocks from me. And why? Because the daughter, who was working, thinks it would be a pretty smart idea to be close to grandparents, even though in both cases that I'm talking about, the grandmothers are working. But they're working not quite as much as they used to, and it's just somebody else who's kind of around who, you don't trust anybody like a grandparent if you've got kids. And it's a help. Other kinds of help with other people you hire, people who are your friends, people who are your neighbors. All of those people in your community can all contribute, as they will expect you to contribute to them, of course, in facilitating getting to this balance. I'm not going to go much further in this, but you've got to let go of the small stuff. And most of it is small stuff. I think Susan is the one who had the quote about a clean house is a sign of an empty mind or something. You just got to let go of worrying about everybody having exactly the right matching outfit or having exactly the soccer shirt that they want, unless, of course, they're going to do laundry, which they should be doing if they're more than 10 years old anyway. And let go of those exacting standards, because in the long run, that's not what they remember, and that's really not what matters. Let the children be part of the solution. Giving your children actual responsibility for family life is a very helpful thing for them to do. And that can start when they're 3 or 4. A 4-year-old is old enough to go get their pajamas on by themselves. And so I'm not saying you can go, if you've got a 4-year-old and you've never done it, don't try tonight to go home and say, oh, okay, go find your bedroom, get your pajamas on, don't worry about it, turn the light on. Parenting involves a lot of prompting and fading, as behaviorists would call it, a lot of scaffolding, and as we build in steps. So tonight, I'm going to sit on the bed, you pull your jammies out of the drawer, find out which drawer they're in, you pull them out, which ones do you want to wear? If you have one of those children who has trouble deciding, then I would say do this the night before. You always have 2 choices ready so that you don't spend 20 minutes on the choices. As kids get older, they can do laundry, they can do dishes. My kids did the dishes from the time they were 12 One of the things my husband and I figured out that actually was a huge contribution to making our lives work is that most nights my family had dinner together. And on those occasions, my husband and I left the dinner table and went to the living room and spent a half an hour talking while the kids did the dishes. It took about a year to get to work smoothly because, of course, there would be water on the floor. It's not my turn, it's Scott's turn. No, it's my turn yesterday, you're supposed to... All that kind of stuff. It took a long time to get it smoothed out. But if you let them defeat you by their protests, you'll be doing dishes the rest of your life, and you and your husband are going to have time to talk. So I'm just saying, children are wired for resistance to change. And they know what constitutes fun and work. Try to teach them, try to talk them into the idea that doing the dishes with their sister will be fun. It's not very good. But doing the dishes because mom and dad need some time, and you're members of this family. And when the older one, I had one scholar and one not. The scholar would say, but I have algebra. Well, the algebra will still be there in 25 minutes, and it's the dishes. So whatever kind of tricks they tried to play, we tried to outsmart them. Another step, do not put your marriage last. These people who get the marital satisfaction curve, so you really can't help it going down some. It's going to go down some, because there's just not the time. And you're exhausted for the first few years, of course. But your goal should be try to keep it not here, this is ground zero, but up around here, and it'll go like this. The weekends out of town go up. The weekends when your children go to camp, go up. There's moments that are good, so that by the time you get here, where they're now actually gone most of the time, there's something left between the two of you besides, who are you? What do you get to do with my life? So you want to preserve that time. And the way to do that is both by protecting some time around the marriage, creating that boundary, and by, even when when you can't get away, still have opportunities or create mechanisms for checking in. Actually, some of the technology can be very helpful with that. You can email each other during the day, or text, or talk on the phone. You can do little things that are less likely to be interrupted by your kids. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, just for a couple of minutes, is how you can think about personal boundaries as a way to manage this. I think of boundaries as the rules that we create for ourselves in order to protect our personal limits, define our personal limits and protect ourselves. So one kind of boundary is who gets to come into the bathroom when you're in there. Probably your 2-year-old, almost certainly not your 16-year-old, maybe your husband, although I always want to have my own bathroom if at all possible. But anyway, that's an example of a kind of personal space boundary. Time boundaries around when do I go to bed and when do the children go to bed. There's millions of examples of these. What we know from family therapy and family systems work is that families that have clear, consistent boundaries have members who function better. The two ways you can mess that up, and we've all messed this up one way or another, are the boundaries can be too diffuse. An example of this I deal with is parents, young parents, who will not set a bedtime for their children because the children don't want a bedtime. So they just wait until the 4-year-old collapses on the couch and then carry the child up to bed. That's a diffuse boundary. And that child is not learning anything about self-soothing or self-regulation by doing that. On the other hand, you can have too rigid boundaries. You must do this way at all times, no exceptions. And for most of life, it's better to have a little bit of flexibility. You know what I'm talking about, that's right, to belabor the point. Okay, so here's a kind of boundary that you're going to run into with work that is probably going to be at least somewhat different than the last time you worked. So the first time I did a talk about technology and its impact on intimate relationships was 5 years ago. The title of the talk then was Love in the Time of Blackberries. So when I pulled that talk out, Susan said, "You did that technology talk, why don't you do that?" So I pulled it out and realized it's almost entirely out of date in 5 years. Because 5 years ago was the very beginning of smartphones. And so the technology was mostly still tied to bigger machines that were a little harder to carry around. Now, your personal device is this big, and you can find out anything and be in contact with anyone, anywhere, anytime. And they can be in contact with you, and that's the problem. So what you're going to find in many places in the paid workforce nowadays is that there is an expectation, which may be implicit or explicit. In some ways, the implicit is worse. That you'll be available at all times. Right? And I'm encouraging you right now to be very mindful of that and to resist it. Because there are certain things in life that you can multitask about. Like you can multitask when you watch Homeland and fold the laundry at the same time. And the reason you can do that is because the parts of your brain that are watching and understanding Homeland are not the same parts of your brain that are folding the laundry, right? So that you can do. You cannot respond to a text or an email from your boss and listen to your son or your husband talk to you about something. Because that is exactly the same part of the brain. It's right here, between your eyes, is the prefrontal cortex. And you can't actually multitask with that. When you think you're multitasking, what you're actually doing is doing this. And you're hearing only about 60% of either conversation. The problem with that, you can do that sometimes, and sometimes it'll work out okay. But if you do that with all of your important relationships, what you're teaching your spouse and your children is that those moments where you are looking at each other and talking about something like what Susie said to me today, or I don't know if I want to go to college next year, or our sex life is nothing like what I'd like it to be, you're not going to really be there. And that will be a big problem. If even creating the expectation of that is a big problem. And here's the insidious nature of it. The technology itself is highly seductive. The technology wants you to pay attention to it. The phones are designed to call your attention. If you do nothing else on your phone, the calls come to you. The emails come to you. Bells are rung. Numbers appear on your iPhone. Things tell you they need your response. And if you want to resist that, you have to put the phone down or put it away. Declare phone-free zones or times in your family's life. And I'm telling you that is very hard to do in today's competitive work environment because of the technology and because of globalization. Because if you're working for a corporation that is doing business in China, the only time you may be able to talk to whoever your counterpart is at 2 o'clock in the morning or at 11 o'clock at night or sometime when you would normally not be in the office. So I don't have global solutions for that to tell you, but I am telling you that you would be wise to think about it now before you jump into that and do find out what the expectations are. So I'll tell you, companies have very odd and contradictory standards. Like almost all companies have a policy that you may not talk on the phone or text while you're in a car if you're working. Because, why? Because they could be liable if you get in an accident, right? But they will also have the expectation you'll respond to any message from your boss or somebody, or customer, or whatever, at any time that it comes. So these are not simple problems that one can just say, okay, I don't answer my cell phone after 6 o'clock at night. You'll have to work out your arrangement about those. But your boundaries about that are one of the things that is going to highlight for your life-work balance. You know, life, as it turns out, in my opinion, is an almost infinite series of small decisions that form themselves into habits that last a long time and add up to something that you often don't know until you've done it for years. And that's okay, especially if you can be thoughtful at some moments about stepping back and seeing, what am I trying to do here? And is anything in my life constraining me from doing it? And if so, is there anything I can do about that? Sometimes there's not. Sometimes things come up unexpectedly, either at work or at home, and you have to respond to them, and you mess things up in your life, and you don't have that balance. But there are times when we can plan and make arrangements and set boundaries that will actually help us preserve our family and non-work life. And anybody will tell you at the end of the day, at the end of a life, no one's ever said, I wish I spent more time at the office. It is our family and close relationships that are most important to us. So thank you for your time today.